Hey, so hopefully y'all can hear me. Um, this is a continuation of the reading of the book Assata Shakur, an autobiography, and we're going to be on chapter 12. I think I can get through 3 chapters in this reading. We'll just see. We'll play it by ear. So I'm going to just jump right into it. All right, chapter 12. When I entered Manhattan Community College, I fully intended to major in business administration and then graduate into a job in marketing or advertising. Instead, I took only one business course. History, psychology, and sociology interested me more than learning how to sell somebody something. I had truly lucked up. I had gone back to school at a time when struggle and activity were growing, when Black consciousness and nationalism were on the upswing. I had also lucked up on the school. Manhattan Community College had a very high percentage of Black and Third World students, more than 50%. The level of activity was high, both on campus and off. The Golden Drums, the Black organization on campus, whose president was a principled, disciplined brother named Henry Jackson, was pushing for more Black study courses, Black teachers, programs more responsive to the needs of Black students, and cultural awareness. They gave all kinds of programs on African dancing, drawing, and more. By word of mouth or by the bulletin board, we would turn on to concerts, plays, poetry readings, etc. The Last Poets, a group of young Black poets, knocked me out. I had always thought of poetry in a European sense, but the Last Poets spoke in African rhythms, chanted to the beat of African drums, and talked about revolution. When we leave their place on 125th Street, I think it was called the Blue Gorilla, we'd be so excited and fired up, we didn't even notice the long subway ride home. If I was running myself ragged before I went back to school, now I was flying. I was learning and changing every day. Even my image of myself was changing, as well as my concept of beauty. One day, a friend asked me why I didn't wear my hair in an afro, natural. The thought had honestly never occurred to me. In those days, there weren't too many afros on set. But the more I thought about it, the better it sounded. I had always hated frying my hair, burnt ears, and smoky straightening, and the stink of your own hair burning. How many nights had I spent trying to sleep on curlers, bound with scarves that cut into my head like a tourniquet? Afraid to go to the beach, afraid to walk in the rain, afraid to make passionate love on hot summer nights if I had to get up and go to work in the morning. Afraid my hair would go back. Back to where? Back to the devil or Africa. The permanent was even the permanent was even worse. Trying to sit calmly while lie was eating its way into my brain. Clumps of hair falling out, the hair on your head feeling like somebody else's. And then I became aware of a whole new generation of Black women hiding under wigs, ashamed of their hair, if they had any left. It was sad and disgusting. At the same time, my hair was conked, but the hairdresser said it was relaxed. To make it natural, I literally had to cut the conk off. I cut it off myself and then stood under the shower for hours, melting the conk out. At last, my hair was free. On the subway the next day, people stared at me, but my friends at school were supportive and encouraging. People are right when they say it's not what you have on your head, but what you have in it. You can be a revolutionary thinking person and have your hair fried up. And you can have an afro and be a traitor to Black people. But for me, how you dress and how you look have always reflected what you have to say about yourself. When you wear your hair a certain way, when you wear a certain type of clothes, you are making a statement about yourself. When you go through all your life processing and abusing your hair so it will look like the hair of another race of people, then you are making a statement, and the statement is clear. I don't care if it's the curly conch, latex locks, or whatever. You're making a statement. It was a matter of simple statement for me. This is who I am, and this is how I like to look. This is what I think is beautiful. You could spend a lifetime discovering African-style hairdresses that are So many of them, and so many creative, natural styles yet to be invented. For me, it was important not just because of how good it made me feel, but because of the world in which I lived in a country that is trying to completely negate the image of Black people, that constantly tells us we are nothing, our culture is nothing. I felt and still feel that we have got to constantly make positive statements about ourselves. Our desire to be free has got to manifest itself in everything we are and do. We have accepted too much of a negative lifestyle and a negative culture and have to consciously act to rid ourselves of that negative influence. Maybe in another time, when everybody is equal and free, it won't matter how anybody wears their hair or dresses or looks. Then there won't be any oppressors to mimic or avoid mimicking. But right now, I think it's important for us to look and feel like strong, proud Black men and women who are looking toward Africa for guidance. It wasn't in school but a hot minute when a brother in my math class told me about the golden drums. After a couple meetings, I was hooked. They addressed me as sister, were glad to see me at meetings, worried about how I was making out in school, and were really concerned about me as a person. The subject of one of many lectures scheduled by the drums was about a slave who had plotted and planned and fought for his freedom, right here in America. Until then, my only knowledge of the history of Africans in America was about George Washington Carver making experiments with peanuts and about the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman had always been my heroine, and she had symbolized everything that was Black resistance for me. But it had never occurred to me that hundreds of Black people had got together to fight for their freedom. The day I found out about Nat Turner, I was affected so strongly it was physical. I was so souped up on adrenaline I could barely contain myself. I tore through every book my mother had. Nowhere could I find the name Nat Turner. I had grown up believing the slaves hadn't fought back. I remember feeling ashamed when they talked about slavery in school. The teachers made it seem that Black people had nothing to do with social emancipation from slavery. White people had freed us. You couldn't catch me without a book in my hand after that. I read everything from J.A. Rogers to Julius Lester, from Sonia Sanchez to I'm so sorry. I did not say that name right. It's Donnell Lee is the dead name. I saw plays by Black playwrights like Amari Baraka and Ed Bullins. It was amazing. A whole new world opened up to me. I was also meeting a lot of sisters and brothers whose level of consciousness was much higher than mine. Black people who had gained knowledge not only by reading, but by participating in the struggle, who talked about Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prozier, and Sanique, as well as Nat Turner, because they had gone out of their way to learn about our history and our struggle. Many of us have misconceptions about Black history in America. What we are taught in the public school system is usually inaccurate, distorted, and packed full of outright lies. Among the most common lies are the Lincoln freed the slaves, that the Civil War was fought to free the slaves, and that the history of Black people in America has consisted of slow but steady progress, that things have gotten better bit by bit. Belief in these myths can cause us to make serious mistakes in analyzing our current situation and in planning future action. Abraham Lincoln was in no way whatsoever a friend of Black people. He had little concern for our plight. In his famous reply to editor Horace Greeley in August 1862, he openly stated, "My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that." Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Immediately afterwards, South Carolina had a convention and unanimously voted withdrawal from the Union. Before he had even been inaugurated, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit. In his inaugural speech on March 4th, 1861, Lincoln said that slavery was legal under the Constitution and that he had no right and no intention to abolish slavery. He further promised to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, which permitted Southern slave owners to reclaim their escaped slaves in Northern states. What the law actually did was give any white man with the certificate of ownership the right to kidnap any free black man, woman, or child in the North and force them into slavery. Because of this position, Lincoln received a great deal of criticism from black abolitionists. Ford Douglass, a runaway slave who accompanied Frederick Douglass on his anti-slavery tours in the West, blasted Lincoln's position, saying, "In regard to the repeal of the fugitive slave law, Abraham Lincoln occupies the same position that the old Whig Party occupied in 1852. Here, then, is Abraham Lincoln in favor of carrying out that infamous fugitive slave law that not only strikes down the liberty of every black man in the United States, but virtually the liberty of every white man as well, for under that law, there is not a man in this presence who might not be arrested today upon the simple testimony of one man, and after an ex parte trial, hurried off to slavery and to chains." On April 12, 1861, Southern troops fired on Fort Sumter, South Carolina, thus starting the Civil War. The response of the Northerners was electrifying. Millions who had been indifferent or lukewarm to the secession of the South jumped on the bandwagon to defend the Union. But the enthusiasm was short-lived. They already viewed black workers in the North as competitors for their jobs, and the white Northerners, for fear of losing even more jobs to the blacks, refused to enlist in sufficient numbers for the North to win the war. When the draft law was enacted, tens of thousands of white workers in New York City took to the streets and brutally beat and murdered every black person they could find. It has been estimated that between 400 and 1,000 blacks were killed as a result of the so-called New York draft law riots. Draft riots and the murder of blacks also took place in northern cities. Lincoln had originally opposed blacks fighting in the Civil War, stating, "I admit that slavery is at the root of the rebellion, and at least its sine qua non," I don't know how to say that, "will also concede that emancipation will help us in Europe. I grant further that it would help somewhat at the North, though not so much, I fear, as you and those who you represent imagine. And then, unquestionably, it would weaken the rebels by drawing off their laborers, which is of great importance. But I am not so sure we could do much with the blacks. If we were to arm them, I fear that in a few weeks the arms would be in the hands of the rebels." That's a quote from The History of the Negro Race in America, Volume 2, page 265. Northern whites were more than happy at the prospect of black people fighting in the war. A popular verse published in the newspapers of the day reflected the sentiment of many Northerners. This is a quote. "Some say it is a burning shame to make the niggers," they literally spell it like that, "the niggers fight, and that the trade o' being killed belongs but to the white. But as for me, upon me sow, so liberal are we here, I'll let Sambo be murdered in place of myself on every day in every year." It was not until 1863 that Lincoln in fact issued the Emancipation Proclamation, but the document had very little immediate effect. It freed slaves only in the Confederate States, and the slaves in states loyal to the Union remained slaves. Lincoln clearly did not believe black people could live in the U.S. as equal citizens. In the Lincoln-Douglas debates, he stated, "If all earthly power were given to me, I should not know what to do as to the existing institution. My first impulse would be to free all the slaves and send them to Liberia, to their own native land. But a moment's reflection would convince me that whatever of high hope there may be in this, in the long run, its sudden execution is impossible. What then? Free them all and keep them among us as underlings? It is quite certain that this betters their condition. I think I would not hold one in slavery at any rate, yet the point is not clear enough for me to denounce people upon. What next? Free them and make them politically and socially our equals? My own feelings will not admit of this, and if mine would, we well know that those of the great masses of whites will not. Lincoln was a firm believer in the massive exploitation of Black people anywhere. In 1865, at the end of the war, he asked General Butler to explore the possibility of using the Navy to remove Black people to Haiti or to other areas in the Caribbean and South America. It's also important to understand that the Civil War was not fought to free the slaves. It was a war between two economic systems, a war for power and control of the U.S. by two separate factions of the ruling class, rich white Southern slave owners and rich white Northern industrialists. The battle was between a plantation slave economy and an industrial manufacturing economy. An industrial revolution was taking place in the years before the Civil War. Inventions such as the cotton gin, the telegraph, steamships, and steam trains completely changed the methods of manufacturing, transportation, mining, communications, agriculture, and trade. The amount of goods produced was no longer determined by the number of people working in the process, but by the capacity of the machines. America was no longer a country that produced raw materials for the manufacturing nations in Europe. By 1860, the census reports that 1,385,000 people were employed in manufacturing and that 1/6 of the whole population was directly supported by manufacturing. The number was much higher when clerks, transportation workers, and merchants were added. As manufacturing centers began to grow, European immigrants were imported as a source of cheap labor. More than 5 million entered the U.S. between 1820 and 1860. Although the South had many cotton mills functioning, the factories were small and their numbers grew slowly. In 1850, the value of manufactured goods produced in the northern free states was 4 times the output of the southern slave states. And with the rise of industry came the rise of economic crisis and the threat of industrial collapse. Even though there have been economic crises in the past, people had generally lived on farms, and the economic depressions didn't create such a great hardship for the masses. But with many people living in cities, economic crises meant unemployment and no way to pay for food, clothing, and shelter. The first big crash came in 1825, followed by further depression in 1829, 1837, and 1847, and a severe depression in 1856. The recession in 1857 almost completely destroyed the early labor movement. The poverty in northern and southern cities was staggering. Rags, filth, squalor, hunger, and misery were words used to describe the ghettos of the 1800s. To solve the problems in industrial cities, many called for reforms such as the abolition of debtors' prison, an end to the laws that kept white men who did not own property from voting, free education, the right to strike, an end to child labor, establishment of a 10-hour workday, and granting of land in the West to poor people in the cities. Big business proposed the expansion of capitalism and industry to other parts of the country, and this was where Northern capitalists clashed with Southern slave owners. Northern capitalists wanted new states to enter the Union as free states. Slave owners wanted new states to enter as slave states. To maintain a balance of power, the North and the South had entered into several compromises. The main one was the Missouri Compromise. Northern capitalists were afraid slave owners would open factories and produce goods more cheaply because they didn't have to pay for labor. White workers were afraid of losing their jobs because of slavery. Southern plantation owners, of course, wanted the system of slavery to expand across the country. All the differences between the North and the South were economic, not moral. For capitalists to control the economy and the political system, the slave system had to be defeated. In 1856, the newborn Republican Party ran Abraham Lincoln, a former Whig, as their first presidential candidate. He lost. In 1860, he ran again with a strong 3-point platform. 1, to shut slavery out of the territories. 2, to establish large protective tariffs. 3, to enact a homestead law giving a medium-sized farm free to anyone willing to till the land. The platform was designed to appeal to rich northern capitalists, poor white laborers, farmers, and abolitionists. For only a tiny portion of the population was the abolition of slavery a moral issue, and the overwhelming majority of the white people who supported the abolition of slavery or who fought in the Union's army did so because they believed it was in their interest, not for love or concern for Black people. I was gradually becoming more active. I began to control my life. Before going back to college, I knew I didn't want to be an intellectual, spending my life in books and libraries without knowing what the hell was going on in the streets. Theory without practice is just as incomplete as practice without theory. The two have to go together. I was determined to do both. The major way I got hip to things was by listening to people. The Black students going to Manhattan Community College belonged to every type of organization. There were Black Muslims, Garveyites, Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity, members of various community and cultural organizations, and a few who were Young Turks of the NAACP. We got together and talked about everything under the sun. I did a whole lot more listening than talking, but I asked questions about anything I didn't understand. Sometimes the discussions and debates got so heated that they lasted until 11 o'clock, when night school ended and the building was being closed up. One of the first organizations I checked out was a Garveyite group that had a big hall on 125th Street. I had just read a book on Marcus Garvey. In fact, I had only recently learned he existed. It was a shame. Here he had headed up one of the strongest movements of Black people in America, and I hadn't heard about him until I was grown. One of the brothers who was studying there invited me to a meeting. The meeting was upstairs. There seemed to be hundreds of chairs in the room. I arrived a little early and hardly anyone was there. I spotted the brother who had invited me, and he introduced me to the 10 or 15 people already there. We sat around in a little group talking and waiting for the others to arrive. They never came. It was obvious that everyone knew each other and had been coming to these meetings for a long time. After a while, a speaker climbed the podium. He welcomed me to the meeting, then gave an impassioned speech. One after another got up and gave speeches as if they were talking to a room full of people. The others applauded loudly. I felt sad. They were such nice people and so sincere, but their circle had grown so small, they were reduced to giving speeches to each other. No movement can survive unless it is constantly growing and changing with the times. If it isn't growing, it's stagnant. And without the support of the people, no movement for liberation can exist, no matter how correct its analysis of the situation is. That's why political work and organizing are so important. Unless you are addressing the issues people are concerned about and contributing positive direction, they'll never support you. The first thing the enemy tries to do is isolate revolutionaries from the masses of people, making us horrible and hideous monsters so that our people will hate us. All we usually hear about are the so-called responsible leaders and the ones who are responsible to our oppressors. In the same way that we don't hear about a fraction of the Black men and women who have struggled hard and tirelessly throughout our history, we don't hear about our heroes of today. The schools we go to are reflections of the society that created them. Nobody is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them. Nobody is going to teach you your true history, teach you your true heroes, if they know that that knowledge will help set you free. Schools in America are interested in brainwashing people with Americanism, giving them a little bit of education and training them in skills needed to fill the positions the capitalist system requires. As long as we expect America's schools to educate us, we will remain ignorant. The parents in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville section of Brooklyn, like Black parents all around New York at the time, were pushing for control of the schools in their communities. They wanted a say in what their children were taught, and how their schools were run, and who was teaching their children. They wanted the local school boards to have hiring and firing power over teachers in their district. But the city's Board of Education and the American Federation of Teachers was against them. A whole bunch of us from Manhattan Community College loaded on the subway and took the train out to a demonstration called by the Ocean Hill-Brownsville parents. As soon as we got off the train, we ran into some students from CCNY, It seemed like the whole train had been heading for the demonstration, and it was just the kind of demonstration I like. An energetic sea of black faces, proud, alive, angry, disciplined, upbeat, and most of all, with that sisterly, brotherly kinship I loved. Several of the parents spoke to the crowd, along with the black principal the parents had insisted on hiring. A black teacher, head wrapped in a gaily, talked about the importance of black people controlling our school. She made sweeping gestures with her bangled arms as she spoke. Everybody dug what she said. We were all high on the atmosphere. It seemed like a kinetic dance was boogieing in the air. Grab something to drink. When it was over, I hated to go home. There aren't too many experiences that give you that good, satisfied feeling that make you feel so clean and refreshed as when you are fighting for your freedom. Most of us felt that taking control of our neighborhoods was the first step towards liberation. We sat in the subway station, tripping. When a train did come, we just let it pass. First, we would take control of the schools, then we would take control of the hospitals, then we would take control of the colleges, the housing, etc. We would have community controlled employment, welfare centers, and city, state, and federal agencies. Hold on for a minute, somebody said. Where are y'all going to get the money to run all that stuff? We'll take community control of the banks, someone else answered. You better take control of the army too, because those banks aren't going to just let you take their money lying down. We'll take control of the political institutions in our community. Then we'll take control of the congressional seats, the Senate seats, the city council seats, the mayor's office, and every other office that we can take control of. We'll take control of the political offices so we can allocate money to the people who need it. Y'all just wishing and hoping, someone said. You can control the social institutions and the political institutions, but unless you control the economic and military institutions, you can only go but so far. Everybody just sort of got quiet, thinking. Well, what are we supposed to do then? Just sit back and do nothing? Fighting for community control is just the first step. It can only go so far. What you need is a revolution. Everybody started talking about what the brother had said. We were all confused, but we were all enthused. That was the one thing I dug about those days. We were alive and we were excited and we believed that we were going to be free someday. For us, it wasn't a matter of whether or not, it was a question of how. We always started out talking about reform and ended up talking about revolution. If you were talking about anything except a few little jive crumbs here and there, reform was not going to get it. I was long past the day when I thought that reform could possibly work, but revolution was a big question mark. I believed with all my heart that it was possible, but the question was how. I had heard a lot about the Republic of New Africa and had promised myself to check it out. The provisional government of the Republic of New Africa advocated the establishment of a separate black nation within the U.S. to be made of what is now South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. At the time, I thought the group was kind of wild and far out, but I got a good feeling about being around them, and the idea of a black nation appealed to me. The first time I attended a Republic of New Africa event, I drank in the atmosphere and enjoyed the easy audacity of it all. The surroundings were gay and carnival-like. A group of brothers were pounding out Watusi and Zulu and Yoruba messages on the drums. Groups of sisters and brothers danced to motherland rhythms until their skins were glazed with sweat. Speeches were woven between songs and poems. Vibrant sisters and brothers with big afros and flowing African garments strolled proudly up and down the aisles. Bald-headed brothers wearing combat boots and military uniforms with leopard skin amulets stood around with their arms folded, looking dangerous. Little girls running and laughing, their heads wrapped with gailies and turning their tiny little boys wearing tiny little dashikis. People calling each other names like Jamal and Malik and Keisha or Aisha. Sandalwood and coconut incense floated through the air. Red, black, and green flags hung from the rafters alongside posters of Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Serious looking young men wearing jeans and green army field jackets passed out leaflets. Exotic looking sisters and brothers decked out in red, black, and green sat behind felt covered tables and sold incense, bead earrings, and assortment of other items. Peace, sister, a voice said. Do you want to be a citizen? What? I asked him without the slightest notion of what she was talking about. A citizen, she repeated. Do you want to be a citizen of the Republic of New Africa? How do I become a citizen? Easy. Just sign your name in the citizen's book. That's all? Yeah. You want a name? A name. Yeah, sister, a name. If you want an African name, just ask that brother over there to give you one. The brother she pointed out was wearing a long bubba with matching pants and a matching Fez type hat. He was wearing various necklaces made of beads, bones, shells, and pieces of wood. His left ear was pierced and his face was strained in concentration, the veins in his forehead throbbing. Without giving it a second thought, I went over to have my name changed. The brother looked at me, asked me a couple of questions which I don't remember, and then began shaking a container furiously. He hurled out the contents, which turned out to be shells, into a soft cloth. After a long, concentrated stare at the shells and after glancing back and forth at me, the brother decided that my name was Yorumi Alodele. I'm sorry, I butchered that. He spelled the name out to me as I wrote it down. Then I hurried over the sister's table and became a citizen of the Republic of New Africa. Yorumi Olodele, I liked the way it sounded. Soft and musical, kind of happy sounding. I filed my new name away in my pocketbook and continued sucking in the atmosphere, tripping out on the idea of a black nation in Babylon, a nation of black people smack dab in the middle of the belly of the beast. Imagining black youth flourishing and being nourished in black schools taught by teachers who loved them and who taught them to love themselves. Controlling their lives, their institutions working together to build a humane society, ending the long legacy of suffering black people have endured at the hands of America. My mind spaced out on the idea, and in a minute I was imagining red, black, and green buses, apartment buildings with African motifs, and black television shows and movies that reflected the real quality of black life rather than the real quality of white racism. I imagined everything from cities called Malcolmville and New Lumumba to a reception for revolutionary leaders around the world at the Black House. Sure enough, I liked the idea of a black nation, but I didn't give it any serious consideration as a possible solution. Back then, the idea just seemed too far-fetched. I guess at the time, having an African name seemed a little far-fetched too. I told my friends about the name, talked about it for a few days, and then promptly forgot about it. It wasn't 2 years later, after college, and more. Sorry, I had to get something to drink. It wasn't until years later, after college and more revolutionary activism and marriage, that I began to seriously think about changing my name. The name JoAnne began to irk my nerves, and I had changed a lot and moved to a different beat, felt like a different person. It sounded so strange when people called me JoAnne. It really had nothing to do with me. I didn't feel like a JoAnne, or no Negro, or no American. I felt like an African woman. From the time I picked my hair out in the morning to the time I slipped off to sleep with Mingus in the background, I felt like an African woman and rejoiced in it. My big, abstract black and white ink blot looking painting was replaced by paintings of black people and revolutionary posters. My life became an African life. My surroundings took on African flavor. My spirit took on African glow. From the paintings on my walls to the big fat pillows on my floor, from the incense burning in the air to the music dancing through the rooms, my whole life was moving to African rhythms. My mind, heart, and soul had gone back to Africa, but my name was still stranded in Europe somewhere. JoAnne was bad enough, but at least my mother had given it to me. As for Chesimard, well, I can only come to one conclusion. Somebody named Chesimard had been the slave master of my ex-husband's ancestors. Chesimard, like most other last names Black people use today, was derived from Massa. Black folks went from being Mr. Johnson's Mary and Mr. Jackson's Paul to being Mary Johnson and Paul Jackson. Sometimes before dozing off to sleep, I would lie in bed and think about it, wondering how many slaves Chesimard had owned in Martinique and how often he beat them. I would stare up at the ceiling, wondering how many Black women Chesimard had raped, how many Black babies he had fathered, and how many Black people he had been responsible for killing. So the name finally had to go. I thought about Ubumi Oladele, but there was no problem. I didn't know, but there was one problem. I didn't know what the name meant. My new name had to mean something really special to me. At the time, there were little pamphlets being put out listing names and their meanings, but I had a hard time finding one I liked. A lot of the names had to do with flowers or songs or birds or other things like that. Others meant born on Thursday, faithful, loyal, or even things like tears or little fool or one who giggles. The women's names were nothing like the men's names, which meant things like strong, warrior, man of iron, brave, etc. I wanted a name that had something to do with struggle, something to do with liberation of our people. I decided on Assata Shakur. Assata means she who struggles. Alubala, I know I'm butchering this shit and I apologize. My tongue is colonized. Means love for the people. And I took the name Shakur out of respect for Zaid and Zaid's family. Shakur means the thankful. At first, the Golden Drum Society concentrated its efforts on Black culture and history, but after a while, we started to examine our role as students. We didn't want to be tape recorders recording whatever information, facts, lies they gave us and then playing them all back during examinations. We began to talk about an education that was relevant to us as Black people, that we could take back to our communities. We didn't want to learn Latin or classical Greek. We wanted to learn things that we could use to help free our people. One of our first struggles centered on student government. Most of us were from working class or poor families, and we wanted a student government that was responsive to what we needed. We didn't need a student government that was brown-nosing the administration in return for favors and good grades. We wanted a student government that supported a Black studies program, more Black faculty members, and other Black causes. As a result, the Golden Drum Society and the Students for Democratic Society ran a joint ticket and won by a landslide. It soon became evident that having control of the student government wasn't enough. It had no real power. We would pass resolutions and come up with proposals which the administration would promptly deny. The only power we had was over the student government budget. Instead of inviting reactionary scholars or politicians to speak, we invited the Young Lords or the Black Panther Party or some other group who was saying something relevant. One of our proposals was for students to work during the summer in remedial programs to improve the level of kids who had trouble with reading and math. Our idea was to have a few kids assigned to each student teacher, and that way, each one would receive the individual attention he or she needed. The academic curriculum was to be supplemented with courses that would enhance the students' sense of self-worth and give them more of a sense of their history. Student teachers would work with parents, visit the kids' home, and create a kind of day camp by offering sports, trips, crafts, etc. Several of the Black faculty members helped us with this proposal. As soon as it was submitted, it was rejected. The administration claimed there was no money. A small investigation into finances, aided by some concerned Black and white faculty members, revealed that the president of the college was living in a house rent-free that taxpayers were also providing him with chauffeur and maid services, and that student fees, which had not been spent in previous years, were being invested on the stock market. A rather strange financial picture was emerging. After we made some of our investigation results known to the administration, we were informed that the money for the project had been found. I bet. As a student teacher, I taught reading and math in the morning and arts and crafts in the afternoon. The morning classes were tiny, while the afternoon classes were large, combining various morning groups. The curriculum included Black history, dancing and drumming, physical education, arts and crafts. In addition to reading and math, there was an excursion every Friday afternoon. My mother thought by teaching reading and writing was a joke. My spelling is terrible, and my skills in mathematics are limited to 2 and 2 equaling 4. To prepare myself for the day's lesson, I had to study just as hard as the kids. My students shocked the hell out of me. Through conversation, it was obvious just how bright they were, yet they scored way below their grade and levels in reading and math. There was such a big contradiction between the intelligence they exhibited in class and their test scores that I didn't know where to begin. The books we had to work with were Reader's Digest, like textbooks that I couldn't even imagine using. I didn't even want to read those things, and I knew sure as hell that my students wouldn't want to use them either. So every day, I took the vocabulary out of those books and wrote a little story, something I thought the students would find interesting, typed it on a stencil, and ran it off. I brought all kinds of books to school for them to read, and as long as they found the books interesting, those students would read until the cows came home. I was learning just as much as the kids. I found it oppressive playing teacher all the time, so every day I rotated the thing around. Everybody got to be a teacher for a while. It was also great for discipline, since if somebody acted up in your class, you were free to act up in theirs. Nobody wanted people to act up in their class, so everyone was more or less cool. In order to teach, each one of us had to prepare our lesson and know what we were talking about. One of the boys in the class worked so hard on his lessons that he would just lay me out. I don't know where he is now or what he's doing, but if he isn't a teacher, it's a damn shame because he would have been a great one. He would cut out pictures and even make up math games for us to play. My class in the afternoon was usually exhausting. Clay, paint, paper mache, over everything and everyone, especially me. The first days of that class, I wanted to do nothing but go somewhere and have a good cry. On the first day of the arts and crafts class, I had nothing really prepared, so I asked everyone to draw themselves. When I looked at the drawings, I felt faint. All the students were Black, yet the drawings depicted a lot of blonde haired, blue eyed little white children. I was horrified. I went home and ransacked every magazine I could find with pictures of Black people. I came in early the next day and plastered the walls with pictures of Black people. We talked about what was beautiful. We talked about all the different kinds of beauty in the world and about all the different kinds of flowers in the world. And when we talked about the different kinds of beauty that people have and about the beauty of Black people, we talked about our lips and our noses. We made African masks out of clay and paper mache, made African sculptures, painted pictures of Black people, of Black neighborhoods. Over the summer, I felt the classroom changing. The kids were changing, and so was I. We were feeling good about ourselves, and feeling good about being with each other. I was so involved in working at the school that I had time for little else. If one of the students didn't come to school, I was at his or her house the very day wanting to know why. I would go home and spend hours rewriting some story or preparing for the next day. Half the time, my mother would find me asleep with a book in my hands and all the lights on. I loved working with the kids and I loved teaching. My mother helped me quite a lot, and we grew closer than we had ever been before. I thought about becoming a teacher, but decided against it. For the first time, I became aware of what my mother had been going through all these years trying to teach the New York schools. Most of these principals are caught up in bureaucracy, and they force the teachers to be caught up in it too. They care more about what the teachers have written in their plan books than what they are actually teaching in the class. My mother was working in an environment where white teachers often showed a hostile, condescending attitude towards black children, and where some teachers thought of themselves as zookeepers rather than teachers. As much as I loved working with kids, I knew I could never participate in the Board of Education kind of teaching. I wasn't teaching no black children to say the Pledge of Allegiance or to think George Washington was great or any other bullshit. That fall, the level of activity on campus surpassed anything we had dreamed of. Large numbers of students became involved in the anti-war movement. It seemed that there was no time to catch up with all the things that were happening. I would be at the construction workers' demonstration one day and then marching with the welfare mothers the next. We got down with everything: rent strikes, sit ins, the takeover of the Harlem State office buildings, whatever it was. If we agreed with it, we would try to give active support in some way. The more active I became, the more I liked it. It was like medicine, making me feel well, making me whole. I was home. For the first time, my life felt like it had some real meaning. Everywhere I turned, black people were struggling. Puerto Ricans were struggling. It was beautiful. I love black people. I don't care what they're doing, but when black people are struggling, that's when they are most beautiful to me. As usual, I was speeding. My energy just couldn't stop dancing. I was caught up in the music of struggle, and I wanted to dance. I was never bored, never lonely, and the brothers and sisters who became my friends were so beautiful to me. I would mention their names, but the way things are today, I'll only be sending the FBI or the CIA to their doors. There were a lot of communist groups on campus. I had no idea at the time that there were so many different kinds of communists and socialists. I had been so brainwashed. I had thought that all communists were the same and that there were Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, Trotsky, etc. Most of the so called communists I met weren't in any party at all, but just related to the philosophy of communism. Most followed very different political lines and policies, and it was difficult for them to sit down and agree on this time of day, much less hatch up some communist plot. I was surprised to learn that there were all different types of capitalist countries and different types of communist countries. I heard communist bloc and behind the Iron Curtain so much in the media that I had naturally formed the impression that these countries were all the same. Although they are all socialist, East Germany, Bulgaria, Cuba, and North Korea are as different as night and day. All of them have different histories, different cultures, and different ways of applying the socialist theory, although they have the same economic and similar political systems. It has never ceased to amaze me how so many people can be tricked into hating people who have never done them any harm. You simply mention the word communist, and a lot of these red, white, and blue fools are ready to kill. I wasn't against communists, but I can't say I was for it either. At first, I viewed it suspiciously as some kind of white man's concoction until I read works by African revolutionaries and studied the African liberation movements. Revolutionaries in Africa understood the question of African liberation was not just a question of race, that even if they managed to get rid of the white colonialists, if they didn't rid themselves of the capitalist economic structure, the white colonialists would simply be replaced by black neo-colonialists. There was not a single liberation movement in Africa that was not fighting for socialism. In fact, there was not a single liberation movement in the whole world that was fighting for capitalism. The whole thing boiled down to a simple equation. Anything that has any kind of value is made, mined, grown, produced, and processed by working people. So why shouldn't working people collectively own that wealth? Why shouldn't working people own and control their own resources? Capitalism meant that rich businessmen owned the wealth, while socialism meant that the people who made the wealth owned it. I got into heated arguments with sisters and brothers who claimed that the oppression of black people was only a question of race. I argued that there were black oppressors as well as white ones. That's why you've got blacks who support Nixon or Reagan or other conservatives. Black folks with money have always tended to support candidates who they believed would protect their financial interests. As far as I was concerned, it didn't take too much brains to figure out that black people are oppressed because of class as well as race, because we are poor and because we are Black. It would burn me up every time somebody talked about Black people climbing the ladder of success. Anytime you're talking about a ladder, you're talking about a top and a bottom, an upper class and a lower class, a rich class and a poor class. As long as you've got a system with a top and a bottom, Black people are always going to wind up at the bottom because we're the easiest to discriminate against. That's why I couldn't see fighting within the system. Both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are controlled by millionaires. They are interested in holding on to their power, while I was interested in taking it away. They were interested in supporting fascist dictatorships in South and Central America, while I wanted to see them overthrown. They were interested in supporting racist, fascist regimes in Africa, while I was interested in seeing them overthrown. They were interested in defeating the Viet Cong, and I was interested in seeing them win their liberation. A poster of the massacre at My Lai, picturing women and children lying clumped together in a heap, their bodies riddled with bullets, hung on my wall as a daily reminder of the brutality in this world. Manhattan Community College had not one course on Puerto Rican history. The Puerto Rican sisters and brothers who knew what was happening became our teachers. I had hung out all my life with Puerto Ricans, and I didn't even know Puerto Rico was a colony. They told us of the long and valiant struggle against the first Spanish colonizers and then later against the U.S. government, and about their revolutionary heroes, the Puerto Rican Five, Lolita Lebron, Rafael Miranda, and Andres Cordero, and Irving Flores, and Oscar Collazo, each of whom had spent more than a quarter of a century behind bars fighting for the independence of Puerto Rico. Once you understand something about the history of a people, their heroes, their hardships, and their sacrifices, it's easier to struggle with them, to support their struggle. For a lot of people in this country, people who live in other places have no faces. And this is the way the US government wants it to be. They figure that as long as the people have no faces and the country has no form, Americans will not protest when they send in the Marines to wipe them out. I had begun to think of myself as a socialist, but I could not in any way see myself joining any of the socialist groups I came in contact with. I loved to listen to them, learn from them, and argue with them, but there was no way in the world I could see myself becoming a member. For one thing, I cannot stand the condescending, paternalistic attitudes of some of the white people in these groups. Some of the older members thought that because they had been in the struggle for socialism for a long time, they knew all the answers to the problems of Black people and all of the aspects of the Black liberation struggle. I couldn't relate to the idea of the great white father on earth any more than I could relate to the great white father up in the sky. I was willing and ready to learn everything I could from them, but I damn sure was not ready to accept them as leaders of the Black liberation struggle. A few thought they had a monopoly on Marx and acted like only experts in the world on socialism came from Europe. In many instances, they downgraded the theoretical and practical contributions of the Third World revolutionaries like Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Agostinho Neto, and other leaders of liberation movements in the Third World. Another thing that went against my grain was the arrogance and dogmatism I encountered in some of these groups. A member of one group told me that if I was really concerned about the liberation of Black people, I should quit school and get a job in a factory, and that if I wanted to get rid of the system, I would have to work at a factory and organize the workers. When I asked him why he wasn't working in a factory and organizing the workers, he told me that he was staying in school in order to organize the students. I told him I was working to organize the students too, and that I felt perfectly certain that the workers could organize themselves without any college students doing it for them. Some of these groups would come up with abstract intellectual theories totally devoid of practical application and swear they had the answers to the problems of the world. They attacked the Vietnamese for participating in Paris peace talks, claiming that by negotiating the Viet Cong were selling out to the US. I think they got insulted when I asked them how a group of flabby white boys who couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag had the nerve to think they could tell the Vietnamese people how to run their show. Arrogance was one of the key factors that kept the white left so fractionized. I felt that instead of fighting together against a common enemy, They wasted time quarreling with each other about who had the right line. Although I respected the work and political positions of many groups on the left, I felt it was necessary for Black people to come together to organize our own structures and our own revolutionary political party. Friendship is based on respect. As long as much of the white left saw their role as organizing, educating, recruiting, and directing Black revolutionaries, I cannot see how any real friendship could occur. I felt, and still feel, that it is necessary for Black revolutionaries to come together, analyze our history, our present condition, and to define ourselves in our struggle. Black self-determination is a basic right, and if we do not have the right to determine our destinies, then who does? I believe that to gain our liberation, we must come from the position of power and unity, and that a Black revolutionary party led by Black revolutionary leaders is essential. I believe in uniting with white revolutionaries to fight against a common enemy, but I was convinced that it had to be on the basis of power and unity rather than from weakness and unity at any cost. This poem is called To My Mama. To my mama who has swallowed the American dream and choked on it. To my mama whose dreams have fought each other and died. Who sees but cannot bear to see a volcano eating its own lava. To my mama who couldn't turn hell into paradise and blamed herself. Who has always seen, reflected in her mirror, an ugly duckling. To my mama who makes no demands of anyone because she don't think she can afford to. Who thinks her money talks louder than her womanhood. To my butch fam mama, who has always taken care of business, who has never drifted hazily to sleep thinking he will take care of it, who has schemed so much she sometimes schemes against herself. To my sweet, shy mama who is uneasy with people because she don't know how to be phony and is afraid to be real, who has longed for sculpture gardens, whose potted plant dies slowly on the windowsill. We have all been affected with a sickness that can be traced back to the auction block. You must not feel guilty for what has been done to us. Only the strong go crazy, the weak just go along. And what I thought was cruelty, I understand was fear. That hand stronger than yours and wider than yours would strangle my young life into oblivion. Mama, I'm proud of you. I look at you and I see the strength of our people. I have seen you struggle in the dark, the world beating on your back, dragging your catch back to our den, pulling your pots and pans out to cook it, a mop in one hand, a pencil in the other, marking up my homework with your love. The injured have no blame. Let it fall on those who injure. Leave the past behind where it belongs and come with me toward tomorrow. I love you, Mommy, because you are beautiful, and I am life that springs from you. Part tree, part weed, part flower. My roots run deep. I've been nourished well. And that's the end of chapter 12. We're finna dive into chapter 13. Let me take a drink. All right, let's do this. Chapter 13. I'm at school when I hear about it. Electric shots are zooming down my back the way they do when I'm about to go temporarily insane. On the train headed uptown, I'm ready to riot. I'm having daymares on the subway, imagining myself with a long knife slashing slits in white sheets. Ku Klux Klan blood is spilling. You want to look like a ghost? You want to look like a ghost? My mind keeps chanting. You want to look like a ghost? Well, I'll make you one. Sitting on the subway, bloody fantasies. I look out at my daymare. Nobody is moving. Everybody screams. Everybody has a frozen face. The train is slowing down. Everybody is tensely looking at the door. 125th Street. I'm going to riot. I want to kill someone. Martin Luther King has been murdered. The streets wake me up. There is no blood yet. Everybody is getting into position. The wind is blowing rumors. The people are waiting. The streets are rumbling. The tanks are coming. The natives are restless. The tanks will quiet the natives. The tanks are coming. I feel absurd and impotent. Who am I to attack? Where is a George Lincoln Rockwell? I'm ready to kill him. He will get a chance to utter exactly 2 syllables before I cut him off. He isn't there. Only the rumors and the rumble of the tanks and the waiting. The store windows are filled with shit. You can't exchange Martin Luther King for shit in the store window. Smashing windows will do me no good. I am beyond that. I want blood. The tanks are waiting to crush the resistance, squelch the disturbance. It crosses my mind. I want to win. I don't want to rebel. I want to win. The revolution will not be televised on 6 o'clock news. I have to get myself ready. Revolution. The word has me going. I'm back on the subway. Nobody's looking at anybody. I think I have my period. Sweat is rolling down my legs. I go home. My mother is glad to see me. She knows that I'm half crazy. The television is wet with crocodile tears. Rebellion, rebellious children, temper tantrums, rebellion, revolution. I like the word. The Grim Reapers are abuzz. Reports about the natives. They are excited. This is the stuff that news is made of. We are looking at each other, impassioned speeches sizzle on their tongues, causing sour ashes to fall from our mouths. We're just sitting there. I'm thinking about revolution, the tonic, abstract, revolution. I'm tired of watching us lose. They kill our leaders, then they kill us for protesting. Protest, revolution. If it exists, I want to find it. Bulletins, more bulletins. I'm tired of bulletins. I want bullets. While I was going to CCNY after I graduated from Manhattan Community College, I decided to get married. My husband was politically conscious, intelligent, and decent, and our affair was frantic, high-pitched, and charged with emotion. Somehow, I believed that our shared commitment to the Black liberation struggle would result in a marriage made in heaven. I spent most of my time at school meetings and demonstrations, and whenever I was at home, my head was usually stuck in some book. It was unthinkable to allow more than 5 minutes on mundane things like keeping house or washing dishes to complicate matters. My husband's ideas about marriage stem mostly from his parents' life, where his mother was the homemaker and his father was the breadwinner. Spaghetti was about the only thing I could cook, and he was profoundly shocked to learn I had none of his mother's domestic skills. After a while, it became clear to me that I was about as ready to be married as I was to grow wings and fly. So after a confused and unhappy year, we decided we made much better friends than marriage partners and called it quits. I decided to go to California. It was becoming increasingly clear to me that although it was important for students to participate in the struggle, no revolution had ever been won by students alone. Struggling around school issues had narrowed my perspective, and I was getting bogged down. I wanted to expand that struggle to the Black community. At that time, California, especially the Bay Area, was where everything was happening. Some of my favorite professors were going out west for the summer, and they offered to hook me up with a place to stay. As usual, I was flat broke, but a good friend gave me the money to make the trip with a little spending change thrown in. My friends found a place for me in Berkeley, the most radical, progressive place I had ever been in. Revolutionary posters were plastered all over the walls along with the people's murals. The fronts of banks and other official buildings were bricked up as a result of the demonstrations and street fighting that followed the People's Park struggles. Red Stars and Mao's Red Book were sold on street corners, and food cooperatives sold health food at cheap prices. People's collectives were dedicated to surviving, struggling, and teaching. I was impressed with the kinds of informal solutions they had cooked up to deal with the problems they faced, and I enrolled in the practical skill classes they gave, printing and layout aid, etc. There were books and pamphlets in the San Francisco and Berkeley bookstores I had never seen in New York, and for the first time I read the theory of urban guerrilla warfare as outlined by Che Guevara, Carlos Marigula, sorry, I'm about to butcher this shit, Marigula, and Tapamaros. Damn, just fucked all that up. I have been more aware of imperialism in Vietnam or Cambodia, and the extent of U.S. imperialism in South and Central America surprised me. The U.S. government had invaded more than 15 countries there, not once or twice, but in some cases more than 10 times. And the guerrilla movements were waging armed struggle in most of them. Reading about guerrilla warfare in South America and Vietnam was one thing, but thinking in terms of guerrilla warfare in the US, well, that was another. Back then, people used the word revolution just because it sounded hip. Half the time, what they were really talking about was change or some kind of vague process. Some meant a separate black nation, and others dealt with black revolution as a part of an overall revolution waged by whites, Hispanics, Orientals, Native Americans, and blacks. Malcolm said it meant bloodshed and land. To me, the revolutionary struggle of black people had to be against racism, capitalism, imperialism, and sexism, and for real freedom under a socialist government. But the reality of achieving it seemed a long way off. In Berkeley and San Francisco, the revolution didn't seem too far away. A lot of white radicals, hippies, Chicanos, blacks, and Asians were ready to get down. But I hadn't forgotten the hard hats and the rednecks and the Bible Belt and the so-called Middle Americans who had elected Nixon. I couldn't imagine the new left talking to these people, much less organizing them and changing their minds. I decided the only way I could help or I could come up with some answers was to keep on studying and struggling. I didn't know how half of what I was studying would fit in, but I figured it would all come in handy someday. I read about guerrilla warfare and clandestine struggle without having the faintest idea that one day I would go underground. It's kind of funny when I think about it because reading all that stuff probably has saved my life a million times. As part of my first aid skills class, I worked as an assistant to a doctor who volunteered once a week at Alcatraz. At the time, Alcatraz had been taken over by Native Americans who were protesting against a long series of broken treaties, genocidal policies, and racist exploitation. Alcatraz symbolized the strength and dignity of Indian people as well as their resolve to fight to preserve their cultural traditions. I enjoyed everything about going there except the trip. The doctor was a motorcycle fanatic who insisted on zooming across the Golden Gate Bridge on that thing, with me hanging on for dear life. Once on the other side, we would jump into a rickety little boat with water in the bottom and limp across the bay to the island. By the time we got there, I felt as if I had done a day's work. The first thing that hit me was the spirit of the people. I felt the tremendous pride, tremendous determination, and tremendous calm from the time I landed on the island until I left. They were Native Americans from all over North America, including Canada, from different tribes and backgrounds. They were young and old. Little babies wiggled in their mother's arms, and one old man who had spent many years in Alcatraz prison said that when he arrived on the island, he had taken a sledgehammer and reduced the cell he had once been locked into rubble. The prison, one of the most infamous and sadistic ever to exist, loomed in the background. There were many different Indian nations, each with its own rich culture, religious tradition, history, and folklore. Everybody was learning and teaching each other their own history and culture. It was a surprise to find out how many Native Americans had been raised in cities and knew nothing about who they were. In that respect, they were very similar to Black people. Most of them were from the West Coast, and so I told them about the Indian Museum and the Museum of Natural History in New York. Suddenly, I stopped short. I wondered how I would feel going into some museum and seeing the houses and stolen artifacts of my people stuck away in some exhibition hall. As I spoke, I realized that most of the history I had been taught about the Indians was probably lies invented by the white man. It wasn't until later, for instance, that I learned that scalping was an old European custom. In the 1700s, the state of Massachusetts was paying the equivalent of $60 for a scalp, and Pennsylvania paid $134. It wasn't until more than 100 years later, in response to the massive genocide at the hands of whites, that the Indians themselves started scalping. None of the little museum exhibits featuring teepees and feather headdresses had ever mentioned how men, women, and children were mowed down at Wounded Knee, or how the U.S. Army had purposely given the Indians smallpox infected blankets. As I listened to those sisters and brothers at Alcatraz, I realized that the true history of any oppressed people is impossible to find in history books. I will always be grateful for having had the opportunity to visit Alcatraz. I will never forget the quiet confidence of the Indians as they went about their lives calmly, even though they were under the constant threat of invasion by the FBI and the US military. They didn't fit into any of my preconceived notions or the stereotype images shown on TV and in movies. They were really open with me, and after a while, we talked about the struggle in general. They had many of the same problems we had: education, organizing the people to struggle, and raising consciousness. They damn sure had the same enemy, and they were doing as bad as we were, if not worse. They told me to check out Aquasini when I returned to New York. I need to decolonize my tongue for real. It was a territory they had liberated on the border between New York and Canada. I told them if they ever came to New York, they should visit me and check out Harlem. Sure. When are you going to liberate it? They asked. Oh. I know that's fucking right. There were a million groups in the Bay Area I wanted to check out. There was so much activity I would have had to spend 28 hours a day just to keep up with it all. Someone I was studying with arranged for me to hook up with the Brown Berets, a Chicano group that had been started recently in California and Texas. It was a brief meeting since the brother with whom I had the appointment had to be on the move. He ran down to me some of the conditions they were dealing with and some of the work they were doing. I had always thought of the Chicano movement as a rural rather than an urban one. Most of the information we had received was about the Chicano farm workers struggle and people like Cesar Chavez fighting to organize them. Boo! Fighting to organize them and abolish the unbearable living conditions and slave wages they were forced to work. I was not aware that Chicanos in the city were fighting against unemployment, police brutality, and inferior schools just like black people. In the same way that the Black Panther Party was trying to organize and politicize street gangs in Chicago, the Brown Berets wanted to politicize Chicano street gangs in Los Angeles. The brother also told me that they had been doing a lot of work around Los Siete de las Razas, 7 Chicano brothers who had been accused of killing a San Francisco policeman. They were later acquitted. I wanted to rap some more about this case because I was seeing the same pattern everywhere. Sisters and brothers being locked up all over the country accused of killing pigs or of conspiring to. The brother had to run though. We promised that we would hook up again, but it never happened. Next, I wanted to check out the Red Guard, a group of young revolutionary brothers and sisters who were struggling in Chinatown, San Francisco. I was especially anxious to meet up with them because it was so hard to get information about them back east. The West Coast has the largest Asian population in the country, and I really wanted to get a good idea about what was going on in the Asian communities. A lot of people think Asians do not experience racism, that they are professionals and business owners, unaware that many are poor and oppressed. Finding the Red Guard was not at all easy. Half the people I ran into had never heard of them, and the other half only had a minimal knowledge of who they were and what they were all about. Someone gave me an address, and since I didn't have the faintest idea where it was, I got a brother to drive me over to Chinatown to look for their headquarters. We ended getting lost and never did find the address. Instead, we ended up eating at a Chinese restaurant and getting into a big debate. He couldn't understand why a black woman wanted to hook up with Chinese revolutionaries in the first place. Ain't nobody gonna free black folks but black folks. Those Chinese don't give a damn about you and me. All they care about is their own people and what's going on in China. I told him that I thought there were a whole lot of us in the same predicament and that the only way we were going to get out of it was to come together and break the chains. The brother looked at me as if I was spouting empty rhetoric. Some of the laws of revolution are so simple they seem impossible. People think that in order for something to work, it has to be complicated. But a lot of times, the opposite is true. We usually reach success by putting the simple truths that we know into practice. The basis of any struggle is people coming together to fight against a common enemy. When I finally did get to meet some brothers from the Red Guard, it was quite by accident and somewhat embarrassing. I was hanging out in the park with the sisters and brothers from the Black Student Union. We were exchanging experiences, talking politics, and smoking reefer. The day was blue and beautiful, and we just sat there lazying in the sun without a care in the world, listening to some rock music that was playing in the background. I had brought a whole pile of leaflets and newspapers from New York to give to them. Everybody was feeling laid back and mellow when all of a sudden a bunch of pigs descended on a group of hippies and proceeded to beat them mercilessly, kicking them and hitting them with clubs. We were all so high, we just sat there watching, like it was a movie or something. By the time we got our voices together to cry out in protest, the pigs were carrying the hippies off. Two Asian brothers came up to us and pointed to the newspapers. "You better get rid of those before the pigs see them," one said. "More are on the way. If you got any grass on you, you better get out of here fast." We were a picture of confusion, stuffing sheets of paper under shirts and into pockets. The Asian brother led our half-day's procession out of the park. "You need a lift?" "Yeah, that's cool." "To where?" "Oh, anywhere from here," one of us answered. We were too high to make any decisions. We piled into a rickety-looking Jeep. They told us they would drive us over to Shattuck Street and drop us off. As we were driving, and everybody started to talk about the pigs beating up the hippies, the image was burning in everyone's mind. "That was a trip," drawled one of the BSU brothers. "Did you see those pigs? I thought they were going to kill those dudes." I was still high, feeling too stunned and eerie to talk. "That's why we need a revolution," the sister was saying. "They just think they can do anything they want to." "What started the shit?" somebody asked the Asian brothers. "It was some hassle about some ID or something. They just wanted to hassle somebody. You're lucky they didn't see you first." We were all silent for a minute, imagining ourselves being beaten and carted off to jail. "It's a good thing they didn't see those leaflets," the other Asian brother said. "They would have hassled you for sure." The sister, who was obviously angry, got off into a political rap. Everybody kind of jumped into the conversation, talking about the situation in the Black community, the Black student struggle, and the overall piggishness of America. Everybody was into the rap, all of us presenting ourselves as political activists and revolutionaries. "Are you guys in the movement?" one of the Asian brothers asked us. Everybody jumped at the opportunity to say yes, giving credentials and naming organizations. "Right on," they said. They told us that they were Red Guard cadre and that they were having some kind of forum on the revolution in China. In my tongue-tied, confused state of marijuana intoxication, I tried to communicate to them that I had been trying to get in touch with their organization to check it out. The brother who had been doing most of the talking reached down under the seat and handed me a leaflet, which had the date and time of the forum. Hold on right quick. Let me grab something to drink. "Make sure you come and check us out," he said. "Put this somewhere where you won't lose it." Making direct reference to my confused, disjointed state of consciousness, "You guys should really be careful with that grass, especially when you've got leaflets and newspapers on you. A lot of good comrades have been busted like that." "Yeah," said the other one. "You got to be alert to deal with this situation. You got to be disciplined and ready to deal with the enemy at all times." The Red Guard brothers dropped us off, and we thanked them in goodbyes amid a hail of right-ons and power to the people. Carefully avoiding each other's eyes, we wandered aimlessly, looking for some place where we could plop down and get our heads together. I was feeling guilty and stupid, silly and politically backward. I was embarrassed to be bumbling down the street in the middle of the day, not in full control of my faculties, too high to deal with the reality, much less change it. I wondered what the brothers from the Red Guard had thought of us, sitting there in a stupor, having to be virtually led out of the park. It was obvious. My stuff was raggedy and that I needed to get my act together. If I wanted to call myself a revolutionary, I was going to have to earn the title. I had heard somebody say that revolutionaries get high on revolution and that it was the best high in the world. "I'm going to check out that high," I said out loud. "Huh? What did you say?" "Nothing," I answered. "I was just talking out loud." "Oh," somebody said. "I can dig it." We stopped off at a coffee shop and had some tea. Everybody looked sheepish and lost in their own thoughts. Finally, we waved our goodbyes and made our separate ways. I walked back to where I was staying, wondering what I was going to have to do to become who I needed to become. Revolution is about change. In the first place that change began is in yourself. The most important organization on my list to check out was the Black Panther Party headquarters in Oakland. I had a whole lot of respect for the party and had been heavily influenced by it, as had almost everyone around my age that I knew. Every time we heard about Huey Newton and Bobby Seale standing up to the power structure, we slapped five and said, yeah. As far as I was concerned, the Panthers were bad, as in good. The party was more than bad, it was bodacious. The sheer audacity of walking into the California Senate floor with rifles, demanding that Black people have the right to bear arms and the right to self-defense, made me sit back and take a long look at them. And the more political I became, the more I appreciated them. Panthers didn't try to sound all intellectual, talking about the national bourgeoisie, the military-industrial complex, the reactionary ruling class. They simply called a pig a pig. They didn't refer to the repressive domestic army or the state repressive apparatus. They called the racist police pigs and racist dogs. One of the most important things the party did was to make it really clear who the enemy was. Not the white people, but the capitalistic imperialist oppressors. They took the Black liberation struggle out of a national context and put it in an international context. The party supported revolutionary struggles and governments all over the world and insisted the U.S. get out of Africa, out of Asia, out of Latin America, and out of the ghetto too. I had gotten to know some of the Panthers in New York when they spoke at the lectures we invited them to at Manhattan Community College. I made it my business to drop by some of the New York Black Panther Party offices and offered to help them with this or that, whatever needed to be done. I was happy to do it. I barely opened my mouth. I just looked, listened, and worked. Some of the comrades would ask why I didn't join. I probably will someday, I always answered. When I heard on the radio that the New York Panthers had been busted, I was furious. The so-called conspiracy charges were so stupid that even a fool could see through them. The police actually had the audacity to charge them with plotting to blow up the flowers in the botanical garden. And the 21 were some of the baddest, most politically educated sisters and brothers in the party. It was an insult. I thought about joining the party right then, but I had some other things I wanted to do, and I needed a low profile in order to do them. As much as I dug the party, I also had some real differences with its style of work. As I opened the front gate of the Oakland headquarters, I felt just as nervous about going inside as I did about the Doberman pinchers running around the yard. A brother opened the door, and I nervously blurted out that I was from New York and I'd come to check out the party. He acted like he was glad to see me and brought me into a room to meet some of the other Panthers. A group of sisters and brothers were sitting around the room laughing and talking. They greeted me casually, passing over a chair for me to sit in. Artie Seal was there, and I had to control myself to keep from gawking at her. I wondered how she felt with her husband in jail, being railroaded and bound and gagged in court. I recognized the names of others. It was strange to be there in a room with those people. It was like sitting down on the pages of a history book. They asked me about New York, and I told them what was happening with the Black students at Manhattan Community College, CCNY, and the Black student movement in general, the anti-war movement, Black construction workers, and whatever other work I was involved in at the time. I told them I had done some work for the New York Panthers and ran off a list of the ones I knew. Somebody asked me why I had never joined the party. Half stammering, I told them I had thought about it but had decided not to. Why? Everybody wanted to know. It was hard for me to say it because I felt so much love and respect for the sisters and brothers seated there, but I knew I'd hate myself if I didn't say what was on my mind. That I had been turned off by the way spokesmen for the party talked to people, that their attitude had often been arrogant, flippant, and disrespectful. I told them I preferred the polite and respectful manner in which civil rights workers and Black Muslims talk to the people rather than the arrogant fuck you style that used to be popular in New York. I said they cursed too much and turned off a lot of Black people who would otherwise be responsive to what the party was saying. When I had finished, I waited nervously, fully expecting them to jump all over what I had said. To my profound surprise, nobody did. Everybody agreed that if That was, in fact, how party members were relating to people they should change at once. One of the sisters pointed out that there was a leadership crisis in New York chapter caused by the arrest and imprisonment of the Panther 21. It was well known by everybody in the movement that the New York police had kidnapped the most experienced, able, and intelligent leaders of the New York branch and demanded $100,000 ransom for each one. One of the brothers explained that the Panthers were facing the same problem all over the country because of persecution by the pigs. We spent the rest of the afternoon rapping about the black struggle in New York and in the U.S. in general. I was deep in discussion about strategy and tactics. Even Emory Douglas came in. I was as happy as a bee in a pollen factory to meet him. I dug his artwork a lot, and I'd even taped a piece he had written on revolutionary art to my closet door. We hit it off at once, and when everybody finished rapping, he took me up to see how the Black Panther newspaper was put together. I was truly impressed by the Panthers in Oakland. After my first visit, I dropped in at their offices regularly. I visited some of the other branches in the area, talking to the people and asking my usual tons of questions. I spent a couple of nights working at the distribution center at the Party paper, which was located in the Fulton district in San Francisco. It was a trip. The papers wouldn't get picked up from the printer until late in the evening, and people would work until the wee hours sorting them out and preparing them for distribution to the Panthers' offices all around the country. Panthers worked there, but the majority seemed to be sisters and brothers from the neighborhood who had just dropped in to give the Panthers a hand. A lot of young people were there, and some elderly sisters and brothers. As we wrapped the papers in bundles, printed addresses, and counted out papers, we sang Panther songs and marching chants. Every now and then, a few stepped outside to sip a little bitter dog. This was supposedly a Panther invention made of red port and lemon juice. It wasn't too bad. Once I got used to it, and by the time 1 a.m. came around, I loved it. Working on the paper distribution didn't even seem like work. It was more like a party. Somebody always gave me a lift home, and I would fall into a happy sleep feeling refreshed and renewed. It was splashed across the papers, blaring on the radio, and yet I still couldn't believe it. The face of the serious young man with the gun refused to leave my thoughts. I must have picked up the same newspaper and put it down 100 times. This shit was serious. 17 years old with the rifle under his raincoat. 17 years old and taking freedom into his own hands. 17 years old and defying the whole pig power structure in America. 17 years old and dead. Tears I didn't even know I had poured out. I got on the phone to find somebody who could explain it all. Who was Jonathan Jackson? Who was the young man who came to free a revolutionary black prisoner, holding a district attorney and a pig judge hostage, shouting, "We are the revolutionaries. Free the Soledad brothers by 12:30." Who was he? I'd only vaguely heard of the Soledad brothers. A brother who knew all about the case broke it down to me. 3 unarmed black prisoners were shot down in the yard by a white guard. A grand jury ruled it justifiable homicide. After the verdict, a white guard was found dead. 3 politically conscious black prisoners were charged with the murder and thrown into solitary. They all faced the death penalty. John Clutchett, Fleta Drumgo, and George Jackson were the brothers charged with the murder. George Jackson, a brilliant revolutionary theorist and writer, was Jonathan Jackson's brother. I couldn't get the whole thing out of my head. Why were grown men and women living while Jonathan Jackson lay dead? What kind of rage, what kind of oppression, and what kind of country shaped that young man? I felt guilt for being alive and well. Where was my gun? And where was my courage? I was dry-eyed when I attended the funeral. There were hundreds of people. We could barely get into the church. They set up a loudspeaker outside so that people could hear the sermon. Black Panthers, solemn and determined, marched in military formation. I was so glad they were there. Black people needed someone to stand up for us, or we will always be victims. I held my arms real close to me, feeling a bit unraveled. Life for us gets so ugly. If I stay a victim, it will kill me, I thought. It was time for me to get my shit together. I wanted to be one of the people who stood up. These were serious times. Angela Davis was running for her life. They had hooked her up with Jonathan Jackson, charged her with kidnapping and murder at the courthouse, even though she was nowhere on the set. They charged her with murder because they claimed that some of the guns used belonged to her. She was one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen, not physically, but spiritually. I knew she was because I had been keeping clips of her in my file. She was a sister who got fired from her job teaching at California College because she told everybody she was a communist, and if they didn't like it, they could go to hell. But I wasn't surprised. They would charge Black people with anything, using any flimsy excuse. We were very glad they hadn't caught her. I hope they never would. The air was charged, everything was happening so fast, and I wasn't blind anymore. I was seeing things straight, seeing them more clearly than ever before. I had so many things to do. If you are deaf, dumb, and blind to what's happening in the world, you're under no obligation to do anything. But if you know what's happening and you don't do anything but sit on your ass, then you're nothing but a punk. I tried to explain how I felt to some of the people I knew. I wanted to struggle on a full-time basis. They urged me to join the Panther Party. I went over in my mind all the criticisms I had of the party. They had said, "You'll be good for the party, and the party will be good for you. The party is only as strong as its people." It made a lot of sense to me. For the first time in months, I felt calm and sure of what I was going to do. I told them that the first thing I was going to do when I returned to New York was join the party. I thought about it all the way home. Of all the things I had wanted to be when I was a little girl, a revolutionary certainly wasn't one of them. But now, it was the only thing I wanted to do. Everything else was secondary. It occurred to me that even though I wanted to become a revolutionary more than anything else in the world, I still did not have the slightest idea what I would have to do to become one. And that's the end of chapter 13. I'm going to try to fit in one more chapter only because there's 21 and I want to try to get through this book this week. Let me grab something to drink. And we're going to knock out one more chapter. "You're the property of the feds now," one of the marshals told me like he really believed it. "We're taking you to MCC, the Federal Prison Manhattan Correctional Center, where you'll stay while you stand trial for bank robbery." It was January 5th, 1976, 15 days after I had been acquitted on the kidnapping charge in Brooklyn Supreme Court. I was still on Rikers Island. He busied himself tying me up with what seemed an endless amount of chains and shackles. Another stupid-looking marshal told me how sorry he was to see me again. He said I'd given him hell the last time. I didn't even recognize him. He said he had worked on the last other bank robbery trial and had gotten chewed out because I got pregnant. "You were framed," I told him. He looked at me all dumb, scratching his head. Yeah, that's right." I started to laugh. Even the other marshals started to crack up. "It's not so funny," he said. "I lost my accommodation that went down in my record." I laughed even harder. The only way I can describe MCC is modern gray with dabs of colored paint here and there. It's one of those ugly inner city fortresses, buildings, anti-nature, anti-human, and cold to all the senses. There's no fresh air because the entire building was air conditioned, and the only natural light came in from narrow glass slits cut into the sides of the building and wired with alarms. The guards looked like space-age robotons with blue blazers, gray pants, walkie-talkies, and beepers. After I had been issued the standard uniform for women, a yellow jumpsuit and tennis shoes, I was led up to the women's section. To my absolute surprise, I was placed in general population, given a key to my cage, and told that there was no lock-in time. We were supposed to stand by the cell doors at various times of the day to be counted. The women's section was a relatively small area comprising a central area for eating and recreation, a TV room, and 3 split-level tiers. There were a few offices, 1 or 2 rooms that served as classrooms. That was it. The only other place the women could go, once in a while, was to recreation on the roof, which was covered with huge metal anti-helicopter bars. After spending more than a month in that confining little place, the women were climbing the walls, and I'm sure the men felt the same way. A few of the federal prisoners were big time with money and connections. They'd been arrested for more sophisticated crimes than the average state prisoner, but the majority were poor, black, or third world, just like in the state jails. But just like in the street, money talks. A lot of the men on the honor floor, which was on the same floor as the women, had money, and rumor had it they would send their favorite guards out to buy them Chinese or Italian food or send them to the Jewish delicatessens, depending on their mood. One drug dealer made frequent visits to the women's section in the wee small hours for conjugal visits with his wife. Since the men on the honor floor had contact with the women, many tried to buy them by sending them huge quantities of commissary items. Others tried to impress the women with tall tales about how much they had ripped off or how big they were on the street. I was sitting on the bench with this white guy, waiting for them to take me to court one morning, and he was steady talking $1 and $2 million deals he had pulled off. He was some kind of con artist, busted for stock fraud. You shouldn't be here, I told him. You should be in the White House with all the other big time con artists. I was trying, he said. I was trying like hell. There were two sisters who I knew from Rikers, and I was really happy to see them both. Skeets was a strong stand-up sister who kept her mouth shut, minded her business, and didn't take any shit from anybody. She was a real warm-hearted person, generous and open, and maintained a whole lot of humanity, even though she was facing a hunk of time on a bank robbery case. I was shocked when I ran into Charlie, who I had known on Rikers as Charlene. She had changed completely. She was no longer the thin, round-faced young sister I had known on the Rock. It was as if she had aged overnight. She had written some dynamite poetry and had been part of our drama group. But this time, she had been arrested for parole violation on a technicality and just didn't give a damn about anything anymore. She was bitter and tired, and her whole attitude can be summed up in two words that she frequently used: shove it. She told me that her freedom depended on whether or not she passed a high school equivalency test. Everybody encouraged her to study, but she just didn't seem to care anymore. She said she was tired of jumping through hoops and didn't give a damn what happened. I understood how she felt, but I hated to see her so bitter and so hurt and know where to go with it. Nothing positive to apply to it. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how, and I was only going to be there for a hot minute. The only thing that perked her up was the struggle the women got into to improve medical care at the jail. At the time, the health situation was horrible. Women came in off the street and were given no physical exams, no tests, no nothing. They had trouble seeing gynecologists and having their most basic needs met, medical or otherwise. Since we were a tiny minority of the prison population, our needs were ignored. The women got together and wrote complaints to the warden. Charlie was one of the women who worked the hardest to get better medical conditions. It's kind of ironic when I think about it now. A little more than a year later, I heard over the prison grapevine that Charlene had died from undiagnosed cancer of the uterus. The Queens Bank robbery trial, which I was here for, was one of the wildest trials I had ever went through. We had just finished with the Brooklyn kidnapping case, and I was not at all looking forward to going to trial again so soon. For almost 3 years now, Evelyn had worked on my cases continuously. She had quit her job as a professor at New York University Law School on the day I was arrested on the Turnpike to become my lawyer. One of the few cases she had accepted since my arrest, mostly to earn some money, was ready for trial, and she couldn't postpone it any longer. So I had to get someone else for my trial. Some of the brothers and sisters recommended Stanley Cohen to me. They said he was a good lawyer and would do a good job on this kind of case. I was hesitant because I had always had black lawyers representing me. I felt that they would probably be more understanding and more sensitive to the situation I was dealing with. I'm not talking about any old black lawyer because some of them make a whole lot of money and think like Richard Nixon. I'm talking about those who are concerned with the plight of black people. I was especially sensitive to the issue after months of listening to some of the sisters at Rikers. They were so brainwashed, they thought a white lawyer, any white lawyer, was better than a black lawyer. They also felt the same way about white doctors, white dentists, and white teachers, etc. I ain't going to court with no black lawyer, they say. I want me a white lawyer who is friendly with the judge and ain't going to make him mad. I tried to tell them that it didn't matter what color the lawyer was if the lawyer went against the judge and really put up a fight for the client, the judge was going to get mad. Few, if any, black defendants have ever been freed because the judge liked their lawyer. If you had a dime for every time a judge and a defense lawyer sat down to lunch and discussed some black client rotting away in jail, you'd be able to stop working and live on the interest. I decided to talk with Cohen and see whether I thought he would be good for the case. Stanley was a middle-aged Jewish, feisty-looking man who somehow reminded me of W.C. Fields. He had a dramatic streak in him and could change the tone and mood of his voice from indignant to pleading in a matter of seconds. He had a long list of acquittals in his record and told funny stories about the strategies he used in this or that trial. He had once been a member of the Communist Party and continued to have progressive politics. Why do you like being a criminal lawyer? I asked him. How can you stand a fight in the court system knowing how much racism and injustice is involved? It was a loaded question, put out there to see how he would answer it. I expected him to say something like somebody had to do it and somebody had to make the sacrifice. I like to win, he said. I do it because I like to win. I liked him and decided I wanted him to defend me on the bank robbery case. Evelyn gave Stanley the transcripts from the time I was beaten up in court by the U.S. Marshals trying to photograph me, together with all the other documents in her file. I worked with him on the trial strategy. Andrew Jackson had pled guilty, so I was on trial alone. Everything was rush, rush, rush. The railroad train was whistling, and it could hardly wait to take me up the river. The new judge assigned to the case wanted the case over with, and he wanted it over with fast. We wanted to question the prospective jurors about their opinions, what they had seen and heard in the media, etc. The judge was determined not to have a long voir dire. I don't know how to say that shit. And so we compromised. A questionnaire was made up asking some of the questions we submitted and others that the prosecutor submitted. After we went through the answers, we were to pick or eliminate jurors, asking additional questions as needed. Also, too, if anyone is listening, if you ever know the word I'm mispronouncing, feel free to tell me in my DMs. I won't get mad. Actually, I would appreciate it. After we went through the answers, we were quick to pick or eliminate jurors, asking additional questions as needed. Some of the answers were so contradictory and such a study on the level of racism in America that it would take a book just to report on them. In 100% of the cases, we were able to tell whether the prospective juror was black, white, or other just by reading the answers. The trial had a lighthearted feel to it. Everyone had kind of decided that we would enjoy the fight and fight as hard as we could without worrying about whether we were going to win or lose. I don't think that there was a single one of us, with the possible exception of Afeni Shakur, who really thought we were going to win. Afeni, who was working as a legal assistant, kept telling me, "We're going to win this one, Assata." But I was sure as hell didn't believe it. They had taken a bank picture of a woman robbing a bank, printed my name under it as being positively identified, and then placed that picture in newspapers, subway stations, and I think even on the sides of buses. They had this picture posted in every bank in New York. There was not a person in New York who went to the bank, rode the subway, or walked the streets who had not seen that photograph with my name printed under it 1,000 times. There was no way of even counting how many times that picture had been flashed on television, with the announcer calling out my name. The public had been so saturated with that image that I felt it was crazy to take this trial seriously. After Stanley was familiar with some of the facts, I had asked him what he thought my chances were. I'd be lying if I told you that they looked good. In reality, they looked pretty lousy. But I believe you, and I'm going to fight for you. And believe me, I like to fight. We agreed that I would act as co-counsel on the case. "You're a lousy lawyer," he would tell me every time we got into an argument over some strategy. "But you're better than a lot of lawyers I know who passed the bar." The atmosphere was electric. The courtroom was packed every day with sisters and brothers who had come to watch the circus. I couldn't stop staring. I've always said that the best thing about being on trial is getting to see and smile at the spectators. Seeing so many beautiful people in the courtroom gave us the push we needed to get down and take care of business. I felt that way during all of my trials, but this trial had an atmosphere that made it even more special. People from all over the Black community dropped by. The Muslim sisters and brothers brought their prayer rugs and broke out into prayer in the hallway of the courthouse. People brought their children, explaining what was happening. One little girl broke up the whole courtroom when she asked out loud, "Is that fascist pig, mommy?" I said that wrong, my bad, because I was laughing. "Is that the fascist pig, mommy?" she asked, pointing to the judge. It was as if Black folks had just taken over the courtroom, letting everybody know that they were watching what was going down. I know that's fucking right. The first thing we did was ask for a lineup. The way I have been identified was from a photo. The FBI had selected my photograph from the militant casebook. This book contained the photographs of all the militants the FBI wanted to send to prison. After they had gotten my photograph out of the militant casebook, they put it in with a few other photographs of women. Of course, mine, a mugshot, was the only one with numbers across the front of it. The rest were normal. The FBI then showed this group of pictures to the robbery witness and asked them to identify someone who somewhat resembled or bore a likeness to the woman who robbed the bank. Two of the people who were in the bank signed affidavits saying that the photograph with the numbers across it, my mugshot, looked somewhat like the woman. The rest, who had been in the bank at the time of the robbery, made no such identification. We told the judge we wanted a lineup because we thought the initial identification of me as the bank robber was suggestive and tainted. But before the judge had arranged for the lineup, the prosecutor called one of the so-called witnesses to testify. Since I was the only Black woman sitting in the defendant's chair, of course he identified me. We protested the procedure, but the judge admitted his testimony anyway. We finally did arrange for a lineup, and of course, the other so-called witnesses picked out another woman. Since the photo identification part of the case was based on nothing more than all niggers look alike, the FBI tried to use scientific, quote-unquote, evidence to gain a conviction. Their plan to superimpose the bank surveillance photo over my photograph failed because they had only one photo of me that was taken at the time at the same angle as the bank robbery picture. It was one of the photographs taken when they assaulted me in the courtroom before the trial began, when I refused to let them take my picture. The FBI had blocked out the faces and hands of the marshals and FBI agents shot, choking and assaulting me. They had cropped the picture so that the only thing the jury could see was my face. But my facial expression in the photograph was one of such agony that it was hard for them to convince the jury of anything else. So the FBI came up with a brilliant idea. They brought in some dude from the FBI who said he was an expert on identifying photographs from examining them under a microscope. He was a real pro, slick and greasy. He had charts and diagrams and whatnot, and I was worried to death that the jury would go for that crap. He sounded real good until it came time for cross-examination. It turned out that he was a specialist in paleontology and had spent a lot of time studying rocks. He tried to claim that his expertise at examining rocks made him able to identify people. Under cross-examination, all his carefully constructed expertise, in quotes, turned into a pile of rocks, and this new technical breakthrough in crime fighting proved to be nothing but a fraud, because the prosecution had been allowed to introduce this new, quote-unquote, scientific evidence. The judge said we had the right to find a photographic expert to rebut the testimony. Since I didn't have a dime, the court agreed to pay for it. The day our photographer expert testified, I slumped down in the seat. He was a real straight-looking white guy who looked like the subscribe to Reader Digest. But the guy had credentials in photography a mile long, and you can tell from the way he talked that he loved photography and that he was incensed over what the FBI was trying to do. He explained to the jury the chemical process of photography and that what the FBI agent said was absolutely impossible. He said that if you look at a photograph under a microscope, all you will see is little dots. His testimony was so correct and his facts so together that the prosecutor barely bothered to cross-examine him. The capper came when the manager of the bank came forward to testify in my behalf. He said that I was definitely not the woman who robbed the bank and that the robber was a different height and weight from mine. We could see the prosecutor quietly creep under his table. His last hope was the summation. In his closing statement, he tried to make up for everything he had not proved with evidence. He painted me as an evil, conniving monster. He told the jury that I was hiding the fact that I had big, fat arms like the woman who was shown robbing the bank, that I was concealing my arms because I had not worn a sleeveless dress in court. The trial was held in the middle of January. As he was talking, I politely rolled up my sleeves right there in the courtroom, exposing my very thin arms. When he got to the final part of his closing, he grew strangely confident. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this woman is very clever, very conniving. She has tried to deceive this jury in every way. But she made one mistake, ladies and gentlemen. She made one fatal error. He then held up a picture of a woman robbing the bank, and in the other hand, he held up my mugshot picture. She made one mistake, he kept repeating. She forgot to change her earrings. She has the same earrings on. The prosecutor was so dramatic. The scene was so straight out of the movies. You could tell he had been watching The Late Show. Both the woman in the bank and I had on hoop earrings. When Stanley summed up, he just said, "Will all the women in the courtroom who have on hoop earrings please stand up?" Half the women rose to their feet. While the jury was out deliberating, I paced back and forth in the holding pen. "They're going to convict me anyway," I told Afeni. "They probably weren't even listening." "That jury isn't going to convict you, Assata," Afeni replied. "Didn't you see the faces of those jurors, especially the black ones?" It was true. I had seen them look at me differently after the truth started coming out. And I knew that the black jurors in the deliberating room would make all the difference in the world. If nothing else, they remind some of the more racist whites that black people are human beings. It's a shame that too many black people try to avoid jury duty instead of trying to slow down the railroad. A lot of times it's a matter of simple economics. Black people often feel they can't afford to sit on a jury, that the money they would lose would mean a sacrifice for their family. And they're probably right. But their sitting on a jury might mean that their neighbor's son or daughter doesn't end up frying in the electric chair or rotting away behind bars. A verdict had been reached. I could tell what it was before we even entered the courtroom. The pigs were upset, to put it mildly. The female guard who escorted me to the court every day seemed glad. The jury read the verdict. Acquittal. The courtroom broke into a loud cheer. The judge just gave up calling for order. He had to wait for the shouting to die down. It was a long time coming. All the spectators were jumping and hugging each other. The marshals led me out of the courtroom and handcuffed me. They brought me back to Rikers Island, where I was put into solitary confinement. And that's the end of chapter 14. So yeah, we got through some more chapters. I'm hoping that we'll get through this book by the end of this week and start a new one. And I'm going to try to put out more free PDFs as well. So I hope people download them and save them. And with that, I hope y'all have a good night. And like always, let's get free.